It was the fall of 1943, and the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe were filled with Allied bombers, as they had been for over 3 years. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, with its 4 massive engines and rugged design, had become a symbol of American air power. It had earned its reputation as a flying fortress, able to take damage and still bring its crew home. But for one particular mission, a B-17 named 909 would prove just how far the spirit of its crew and the indomitable design of the aircraft could carry them. The mission was routine for the crew of 909, another bombing raid over Germany, aimed at crippling the Nazi war machine. The Allied bombing campaign was in full swing, and these raids were critical in debilitating German military infrastructure. But for Captain Robert "Bob" Anderson and his crew, this mission would turn into something far more extraordinary. As the B-17 Flying Fortress flew toward the target, a German munitions factory deep in Nazi-occupied territory, the crew of 909 was prepared for the usual dangers. Enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and the harrowing experience of high-altitude combat. It was business as usual. The skies were filled with German fighters and the incessant threat of flak, anti-aircraft fire, but none of the crew expected the events that would soon unfold. The German Luftwaffe had been engaging the Allies with increasing frequency. Their fighter pilots were skilled, and their strategy was becoming more lethal as the Allies pressed deeper into German-controlled Europe. As the mission began, the B-17 crews were no strangers to danger. These bombers, heavily armed and built to withstand punishment, had seen their fair share of battle. The men inside them, pilots, gunners, bombardiers, were veterans, their nerves sharpened by the constant threat. Yet, on this particular day, they would be tested like never before. As the B-17 formation flew over enemy lines, Captain Anderson and his crew were ready for the familiar barrage of enemy fire. Flak shells exploded around them as they reached the target area. It was deafening, the sound of anti-aircraft artillery mixed with the sharp, violent whistle of nearby shells. But the B-17s pressed on, their mission clear. Drop their payloads, destroy the target, and get out. But this mission would be far more complicated than just another raid. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, and the voice of the squadron commander shouted, "Bandits! At 12 o'clock high!" A moment later, the German fighters appeared, descending from the clouds like a swarm of angry bees. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were some of the most feared aircraft in the skies, and the crew of 909 was now in the midst of an all-out attack. "Brace for impact!" shouted First Lieutenant Tommy Hughes, the navigator, as he gripped the armrests of his seat. The crew had only moments to react, and the B-17 was already shaking from the first bursts of enemy fire. It was a blur of gunfire, evasive maneuvers, and confusion. But the B-17 wasn't made to outmaneuver enemy fighters. The Flying Fortress was built to endure. Captain Anderson, despite the chaos around him, had trained for these moments. He pushed the throttle forward, trying to increase speed and keep the aircraft as stable as possible. But the German fighters were relentless, swooping in and out of the bombers' formation. "Watch out! They're coming in from the tail," shouted Sergeant Henry Hank Lawson, the rear gunner, his eyes glued to the targets in his sights. The tail section of the 909 had been hit several times, but the plane pressed on, its engines still roaring, its guns firing back. The enemy fighters were everywhere, swooping in for another attack. The air was filled with tracer rounds and the sounds of battle. The B-17 crew, having been in countless engagements before, knew the drill: fire back, maintain formation, and get the bombs on target. But suddenly, something went horribly wrong. There was a violent explosion from one of the engines. It wasn't just a hit, it was a critical strike. One of the engines on the B-17 caught fire. Flames erupted from the left side of the plane as smoke poured into the cockpit. The crew was instantly jolted by the impact. Captain Anderson grimaced as he tried to keep the aircraft stable, but the loss of one engine changed everything. "We've lost engine 2!" shouted Bill Haskins, the co-pilot, over the intercom. "We're going down unless we get control!" The B-17 Flying Fortress was a resilient beast, but a single engine out over enemy territory was a severe handicap. With 3 engines still running, it wasn't enough. The aircraft began to bank slightly to the left, struggling to maintain altitude. Thompson's crew was fighting the aircraft like never before, trying to get it to the target and back to base. But just as they thought they might have the situation under control, another burst of German gunfire ripped through the fuselage, hitting the tail section. This was a severe blow. The plane was now losing altitude at a dangerous rate, and the rest of the crew could feel the plane lurch under them. The rudder was damaged, and the aircraft was becoming more difficult to maneuver. Despite the damage, the crew refused to give up. They still had a job to do. Lady Luck had been through hell, but the veteran crew wasn't about to let her go down so easily. "We've still got our guns. Return fire!" ordered Captain Anderson as the Me-10-9s continued to press their attack. Despite the failing engine, the B-17's heavy armor was still taking a toll on the German fighters. The rear gunners, nose gunners, and wing gunners opened fire, sending several German planes spiraling down in flames. "They're pulling back!" shouted Sergeant Lawson. The German fighters were hesitant now. It was clear that the B-17, despite the damage, had proven itself to be more than just a target. Lady Luck wasn't just limping, it was still fighting back. And in the chaos of the moment, the Germans hesitated. They didn't know how to engage a bomber that should have been an easy kill, but wasn't. "We're not out of the woods yet! Keep it steady!" Thompson barked, his voice steady despite the tension. The remaining engines on the B-17 sputtered, their roar growing fainter with each passing second. Thompson knew their best chance now was to make it back to RAF Northolt, a British airbase not far from their position. But the flight home wasn't going to be easy. They had to cross enemy territory, and with one engine gone and the tail section damaged, they were vulnerable. But Thompson knew they had no choice. "We're going home. We're not leaving anyone behind." The battle was far from over. The skies over Nazi-occupied Europe were still filled with German fighters, and Lady Luck's crew had little chance of outrunning them. Their B-17 Flying Fortress was crippled, one engine dead, the tail section severely damaged, and now, as the bomber limped toward RAF Northolt, they were flying straight into a storm. Wind, rain, and low visibility made the return trip even more perilous. Despite the overwhelming odds, the crew's morale remained surprisingly high. The B-17 was a tough machine, built to endure. It had been through hell, but it wasn't giving up yet. Captain Robert Bob Anderson, the pilot who had been at the helm when the damage occurred, was severely wounded, unable to fully control the aircraft. But he didn't need to. Bill Haskins, the co-pilot, took charge of the flight, but there was another, more pressing issue at hand. The weather was growing worse. Clouds swirled around them, blocking their view of the ground, while the storm buffeted the plane from every direction. The aircraft rocked from side to side, and the feeling of being helpless in the air began to set in. The crew couldn't escape their fate. The only option left was to hold steady and pray they could make it home. "We can't keep this up much longer," Haskins said, his voice strained. He had been flying for years, but this felt different. The danger was immediate, and every second counted. Their fuel reserves were rapidly depleting, and the engine that was still running was faltering. Each minute, each mile, they were getting closer to the edge. "We're going to make it, Bill. We have to. Thompson's voice came over the intercom, steady, but with a hint of determination. The pilot, despite his injuries, was still fighting. He had been with the crew for months, through thick and thin, and he wasn't about to give up now. Below them, the English Channel lay shrouded in mist, barely visible in the storm. If they could just get across, they would be within range of British airfields. RAF Northolt wasn't far, but the journey through enemy airspace would test the limits of the B-17. Without the power of its full engines, they were vulnerable. The crew had to rely on the resilience of their aircraft and the courage of their pilots and gunners. "How are we looking, Lawson?" Haskins asked, checking the status of their defensive firepower. Sergeant Henry Hank Lawson, the rear gunner, had been constantly on alert since the moment the German fighters attacked. "We've still got ammo, but I can't guarantee how much longer we can hold them off." Lawson's voice was tinged with frustration, but there was a note of defiance as well. They were already outnumbered in the sky, and though the German fighters had pulled back earlier, there was always the risk they would return in force. "We can't outrun them, Hank. We've got to get to base. We'll have to fight our way through if we have to." Haskins's words were calm, but laced with the urgency of their situation. As if on cue, a distant sound reached the crew's ears, a drone in the sky getting closer. The German fighters were back. The crew could see them now, darting through the mist, their guns blazing. Messerschmitt B.F. 1.0. Nines, as deadly as ever, were closing in on the vulnerable bomber. The B-17 was struggling, barely able to keep its altitude, and now the threat of enemy fighters was more imminent than ever. "Here they come, Bill!" Lawson shouted over the intercom. "And they're not holding back." The B-17 had been hit several times already, and its ability to defend itself was quickly diminishing. The turrets were manned, and the gunners opened fire, sending tracer rounds into the sky, hoping to disrupt the attacking fighters. But Lady Luck's damaged state made it harder to maintain the tight formations that would keep them safe from enemy fire. "Stay steady, men. Don't give up." Thompson's voice rang out, and for a moment the crew found solace in his calm assurance. He was wounded, but his spirit was unbroken. The German fighters dove toward them, their guns firing relentlessly, their intent clear: bring down the B-17. But Lady Luck had one more trick up its sleeve. The bomber's slower speed, caused by the dead engine, created a kind of unpredictability. German pilots, accustomed to attacking bombers at high speeds, found it difficult to line up clean shots. The B-17 wove through the clouds, the gunners firing in quick bursts. But it wasn't just the gunfire that saved them. It was the speed advantage that the German pilots had lost. "They're confused. They don't know how to approach us," Lawson yelled as another Me-109 broke off its attack, frustrated by the bomber's erratic, unpredictable flight pattern. The German fighters hesitated again. They had expected the B-17 to be easy prey, but it was no longer the predictable target they thought it was. Lady Luck, battered and wounded, had forced the German pilots into a state of uncertainty. The broken engine, which should have been a fatal flaw, was now playing a crucial role in the bomber's survival. The faltering engines created a low-speed, almost dancing flight path, making it difficult for the Me-10-9s to line up their attack. "Keep firing, men! Let's make it count!" Thompson shouted as the Me-109s regrouped, preparing for another run. The crew had been pushed to the limits of their endurance, but they kept fighting back. The turrets fired, sending rounds toward the approaching German fighters, and for a moment, the sky above seemed to quiet. The German fighters broke off, and the B-17 flew on, battered but not broken. We're getting closer, men. Just a little longer. We're almost there. Thompson spoke, his voice steady. The distance to RAF Northolt had never felt longer. The plane's engines groaned under the strain, the damage evident at every turn. The fuel was running low, and with each passing second, it seemed like the situation could worsen. But Lady Luck had carried them this far. Through the chaos of enemy fire, the damage, and the ever-growing storm, this flying fortress, damaged beyond belief, had made it through. As the clouds parted, revealing the English Channel below, a sense of hope surged through the crew. They could see the faint outline of England in the distance, a sign that they were finally out of immediate danger. But there was still the matter of making it back to base. The storm had only intensified, and the bomber was struggling to maintain its course. "Just a little further, man. Stay with me." Thompson's voice rang out. He pushed the controls, coaxing the last remnants of power from the struggling engines. The RAF base was close now, just beyond the horizon, and in the distance, the lights of RAF Northolt began to flicker through the mist. The mist began to clear as the English coastline came into view. For the crew of Lady Luck, it was a sight more welcome than anything they had ever seen. After hours of flying with one engine dead, a tail section damaged, and a dangerously low fuel gauge, the crew knew they were nearly home. But they also knew the road wasn't yet clear. "I can see the runway," shouted Sergeant Bill Haskins, the co-pilot, his voice filled with relief. They had crossed the English Channel and were now within range of RAF Northolt. But the journey wasn't over yet. The storm raged on, pushing the bomber further off course. With one engine out, the aircraft had become hard to control, and the remaining engines were struggling to maintain enough power to keep them aloft. "We're going to need a perfect landing, men," Captain Thompson said, his voice calm but filled with determination. Even though he had been wounded earlier in the mission, his resolve remained unshaken. He knew the crew had given everything they had, and now they had one last challenge to overcome: bringing Lady Luck home. "We've made it this far. We'll make it all the way. Just stay focused." Thompson's words had an edge of calm reassurance, but his thoughts were racing. The aircraft was wounded, the storm was fierce, and they were low on fuel. Everything rested on this final stretch, landing safely at RAF Northolt. As they approached the airfield, the winds picked up, making it even more difficult to keep the bomber stable. The landing gear dropped, and Thompson lined up the aircraft as best he could. The weather was unforgiving, but he had flown through far worse. The B-17 was a heavy aircraft, and landing it with one engine out was a delicate maneuver. But Thompson had no choice. The alternative was too grim to even consider. The crew fell into a tense silence as Lady Luck descended toward the runway. The landing lights from RAF Northolt blinked through the storm like a guiding beacon. The aircraft was flying low, barely above the treetops, with its wounded frame trembling against the gusts of wind. The flickering lights of the base were growing larger, and every second felt like an eternity. Thompson's grip tightened on the controls as he gently pushed the throttle, trying to coax every ounce of power from the remaining engines. The runway was almost within reach, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. If they didn't land perfectly, the entire crew would be in jeopardy. "This is it, men! Hold tight!" Thompson shouted, more to steady himself than anyone else. The rest of the crew braced for the impact, holding their breath. With no time to spare, Lady Luck touched down on the runway, its wheels skidding along the wet tarmac. The aircraft bounced slightly, the damaged tail section making the landing even more difficult. The engines sputtered, barely keeping the plane under control, but Thompson had done it. The bomber's landing gear held firm, and they skidded to a stop just as the twin blurs of emergency vehicles appeared from the base, racing toward them. "We're on the ground!" Haskins shouted, his voice filled with unrestrained relief. The rest of the crew exhaled, their bodies sagging in the seats as they took in the moment. They were back, alive. RAF ground crew ran toward the B-17, waving their arms frantically, signaling for the bomber to move to a safer area. It wasn't long before the airfield was alive with activity. Mechanics, engineers, and ground crews were already preparing to handle the aftermath of the damaged aircraft. But for now, none of that mattered. The crew of Lady Luck had made it. As the crew of Lady Luck disembarked from the aircraft, their legs wobbled beneath them. The tension of the mission had left them drained but deeply grateful. They had survived against all odds and made it back to RAF Northolt after an ordeal that would go down in aviation history. The ground crew immediately surrounded them, offering congratulations, admiration, and a few moments of camaraderie. "What a miracle," one of the ground crew muttered as he looked up at the battered B-17. The tail section, riddled with holes, looked like it had gone through a storm. The damage was extensive, and the broken engine had nearly taken them down. Yet somehow, against all the odds, Lady Luck had flown back to safety. But there was no time for celebration just yet. Captain Thompson, though relieved, knew the job wasn't over. He had to debrief and report what had happened during the mission. The RAF command needed every detail of the mission to assess the damage to their aircraft and adjust their strategy moving forward. "You did it, Captain," said Sergeant Henry Hank Lawson as he clapped Thompson on the back. "We all did it. Lady Luck never gave up." Thompson managed a tired smile. "We didn't give up either, Hank. Not on her. Not on each other." The crew exchanged exhausted but knowing glances. They had come through something far beyond ordinary. They had faced imminent death, and yet they had fought for their survival in a way that only true warriors could. The story of Lady Luck's survival spread quickly through the ranks of the Allied forces. News of their miraculous return reached RAF Northolt, where air crews from other units looked at the damaged B-17 with admiration and awe. The idea of a bomber returning with no pilot in full control, limping through the skies after suffering extreme damage, became the stuff of legend. The Lady Luck crew's story would go on to inspire countless others. Their tenacity, bravery, and resourcefulness were emblematic of the resilience that the Allied forces would need to win the war. They had not only survived against overwhelming odds, but had turned what seemed like certain failure into a story of triumph. For the crew of Lady Luck, the battle was not over. They would return to the skies again, facing the same threats, the same challenges. But now, they knew something vital. They could survive. If Lady Luck could come home after such an ordeal, so could they. In the months that followed, the B-17 Flying Fortress would become even more of a symbol of resilience and survival. The story of Lady Luck's return became a part of war history, one of the many accounts of the flying fortresses that helped bring victory to the Allies. But for the crew, the miracle landing wasn't about glory. It was about what they had proven to themselves and each other, that they would not give up no matter the odds. As the war raged on, Lady Luck would continue to serve, flying over Europe and even into Nazi-controlled territories. Its engines would roar once more, its guns would fire, and its crew would return to the skies, but they would always carry the memory of that one mission, the mission where, against all odds, they returned home with no pilot at the controls, proving that the will to survive could sometimes be the greatest weapon of all.